So thank you so much for being here today as a part of an important conversation on children and privacy. I want to introduce you to our panel. My name is Chris McKenna. I'm the founder of an organization over in North America called Protect Young Eyes. We're boots on the ground working in communities with parents and schools and churches, trying to help them create safer digital spaces for our children, and that includes guarding their privacy when necessary. I want to introduce my team here, up with me here today. First, sort of on the end, my friend Dr. Gaia Bernstein, professor, Seton Hall University of Law, and author of the amazing book Unwired, Gaining Control Over Addictive Technologies. I would highly recommend that you also find Gaia's TED Talk. It gives you a good angle for directing some of the anger that we have toward technology in the right direction. Such a good talk. Here next to me, I have Dr. Bilel Jamoussi, the Deputy Director, Telecommunication Standardization Bureau, the Chief of Telecommunication Standardization Policy Department with the International Telecommunications Union. So thankful to have you here today. And then there in the middle, we have Leanda Barrington-Leach, the Executive Director of the Five Rights Foundation, an organization that I have admired for years from afar over in the States for their amazing frameworks and just clarity of thinking around these issues that can sometimes feel so abstract, and they bring that down into the understandable. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation here, because in a world where every click, like, search, pause, and view is tracked, who truly controls our children's data? And as our lives become more integrated with technology, we've woven it into all parts of their life. It's not as if there's children and then tech. They've been woven together in almost all parts of their life, which means they have unique vulnerabilities that they face in our data-driven world. Now, I was having the conversation earlier. I'm a former CPA, an accountant in recovery, maybe you could call me. And so I tend to make sense of the world through numbers, things that are big and sometimes subjective. Give me some numbers and that helps me. So I just want to start with a few numbers to help us understand this issue of data privacy. In December of 2022, a report from the Internet Safety Labs found that 96% of educational technology apps were deemed unsafe for children because they share information with third parties or have ads that are unregulated inside of them. Another data point here, in 2020, the London School of Economics, they released their every 10-year report of European kids online. And I found this one fascinating, right? Even from a different angle. In Romania, 29% of children in Romania have had to tell their parents to take something down that they posted about them as children that they didn't agree with. Right? So even a different angle on this, right? Saying, hey, mom or dad or grandma, I don't like that picture or that information. And that's just an interesting transaction. And then finally, one that's very personal to me, there's an application over in the States called Power School. Power School controls 60 million kinder through 12th grade student and teacher records. And now they're being sued in 28 cases because at the end of December, they had a data breach which exposed social security numbers, dates of birth, records related to discipline, and also mental well-being and special needs. And my school district was one of those impacted. And 2 days ago, I was online searching for identity protection for my teenage sons because of this data breach, right? So these are things that I think we feel, and they sneak up on us. You don't think about data and privacy in children until you need to. But I want us to think about it today. So I'm going to ask my friends here just to explain, right, with something like data privacy, which sort of lives in the background. Leanda, you and I were talking about it. It's almost like carbon monoxide. You don't think about it until you almost need to, and it lingers in the background. What is it about each of your positions that intersects with this issue related to children's data and privacy? Bilel, you want to start us off? Just a quick snip there for us.
Happy to. Good morning, everyone. So, the ITU develops standards, capacity building, and convenes meetings between member states, private sector, and academia. So this issue of cybersecurity and data protection has been always on the mindset of everyone. What we have done is to develop a standard on personal identifiable information, which is a starting point to be able to protect people.
That's right.
And that's a widely deployed, widely adopted standard around the world. So I'll start with that.
Excellent. We'll have a chance to dive into that because I think that idea of PII is so critical as a part of this conversation. Thank you very much. Leanda, why don't you go ahead? Good morning.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. So the Five Rights Foundation, our mission is to build the digital world that children deserve. So we really work on children's rights in the digital environment. But of course, in a data economy and a surveillance economy, like privacy and children's data privacy is absolutely at the core. So one of the first and foundational things that the Five Rights Foundation did was work on pioneering data protection legislation for children, and we shaped and helped pass the age-appropriate design code in the UK, which is under the General Data Protection Regulation. So it really sets out how general data protection law needs to be implemented in order to be compliant with children's rights. And since then, we have worked on replicating that a bit around the world. So we sponsored and supported the California Age-Appropriate Design Code, the Maryland Kids Code, which is essentially the same, Vermont also in the US, but we're also working in Canada. There's an Indonesian Age-Appropriate Design Code. There's an Argentinian Age-Appropriate Design Code. Excellent. Not passed yet. We're working on that. Yes. Because Global South, it's really, really important that we have mirroring standards so that we get to global standards. Excellent. So that we can work on a global issue. And we work a lot on technical standards as well, also with the ITU, and on compliance, so enforcement cases under data protection law.
Well, I'm looking forward to circling back to the age-appropriate design code because I think that's a lot of really good gold in there for us to explore. What can we do in our own communities or our own states or our own countries to bring that to more places? So thank you. And then Gaia, go ahead. Thank you.
So I actually started with privacy. I became a professor. It was one of the first courses I taught. I founded an Institute for Privacy Protection. But sometime around 2016-17, I felt that the biggest issue is how much time we're spending on screens, and especially our children are spending on screens. And I ended up starting an outreach program for parents and kids on the topic, combining privacy and screen addiction. And at this point, I think the issues are very much related. They're very much of the very same business model that tech companies use. They use our data and our time. And I think that solutions for one always help to solve the other. So we always have to talk about the two together.
Right. No, that's great. Just like a web that is connected, these issues are very much connected. And so I'm glad that we can go that way. Well, I want to frame the issue here so that we can get to hope and to get to solutions here. But what are some of these long-term consequences for something that we just often don't wake up and think about? As a parent or even as a professional or an adult, I can tell you that when I woke up this morning, I didn't wonder about data and privacy. So what is it about this that has long-term consequences for our children and their data being collected from an early age? And how will this shape their identities online later in life? Gaia, I know you ended kind of with that intersection. Do you want to go ahead and start us off? What are some of those long-term consequences?
Yeah, I think there are a few. I'll highlight one of them. And I think when we grew up, the idea of growing up was an idea of exploration. Right. You explore what you want to do. You try on different identities. I wanted to be an actress. I ended up a law professor, which sounds very different, but actually not completely.
That's right. Yeah, that's
right. Once I started teaching, I realized that case law have lots of stories behind them, and I'm really acting out my actress part. Now, kids today are not on a mission for exploration. They are in what I would call a mission of constriction, because when they get most of the information online, and they go online, and they are served information which is based on their previous choices and what companies think they would like to see based on where they live, who they interact with, what they looked at first. So there's an illusion of information and autonomy and expansion, but the reality is that they're not making the choice and they're not going through the same exploration that we were lucky to go through.
Wow, that's a fascinating way to think about it. As you were speaking, Gaia, I'm almost envisioning a puppeteer over a child, right? Instead of us as children sort of moving our way serendipitously through childhood and sort of bumbling and stumbling and experiencing and finding our way, there's that constraint word that you used, right? There's flexibility in the strings to an extent, but ultimately there's only so far that we're being permitted, or our children are being permitted to explore what their childhood, what their dreams are of what they could become. So just a powerful, thank you for that. That really expanded my understanding there too. Others, just to explore from different angles, whether internationally or country, what are some things that we see in terms of the harms when we do not protect the privacy of our children?
Well, I could definitely build on what Gaia said, which I completely agree with, obviously. But so we're in a system where, I don't know if any of you attended the panels here yesterday, but there was some really good material on this, and also some former engineers working at some of the big tech companies who were explaining as well the business model behind, and how, and in this publication, by the way, which I think is, has a lot to answer this question. You're welcome to take one. It is about the cost of persuasive design. So it sets out also like the design strategies. So it's not just, these are not unfortunate consequences, right? This is designed into the system. The intention is to modify behavior. The intention is to get people, users, to stay online, to share more, to create content, to expand reach, to get more people in. I mean, you all know notifications, add more friends, send this to 20 people, whatever it is. This is very much the business model, and it's including targeting our children, not just including targeting our children. It is actually, children are a major, major market. I don't know if you saw any of the leaked documents from the TikTok case in the US. It's very, very clear that not only children are a pioneering market and the first market, but they spend a huge amount of time online, but also they are obviously the future market. Get them as young as you can, and that's when education technology is also a very, very powerful tool. Get children hooked into, for example, the Google system through their school even. Right. You've got them for life. My son speaks in Googleese, frankly. It drives me crazy. So, you get them in, and then what are indeed the long-term consequences? Well, it includes things like nearly around half of children say that they themselves feel addicted to the internet. And then, of course, you have high proportions of actual addiction, but you also have personal anxiety, low self-esteem, depression, suicide rates going through the roof, body dysmorphia. You have bullying and aggression. You have denuded relationships, loneliness, loss of purpose. These were also discussed yesterday. Attention deficit, talk to teachers, impact on the education and skills, early sexualization, porn addiction, huge numbers of porn addiction, sexual abuse from contact with strangers, but also among kids, and all of that. And then you also have the lost opportunity cost, right? They could be using this time far better and more usefully.
And that list, right, whether you're a parent or a professional or an amazing aunt, that is a list that makes you shudder. But I think one of the things that often doesn't get talked about enough is that very last thing that you said, the opportunity cost. The simple amount of time. It's a fascinating exercise because iPhones, I don't know about you, but every Sunday morning I get delivered this guilty reminder of how much time I was on my device for the previous week. And you kind of go, oh, thanks, I think. And I think sometimes children really don't understand what they are missing out on, right? Just by simply looking up more than looking down. And I think that's a really important point that we can even explore with them to get them to realize that. So what else might you add to that list, or some of those things that are just sort of out of sight, out of mind?
Yeah. Well, as a parent, I had 3 boys, and they're 20 now to 26.
Excellent.
And we had to live through this. So as also a computer engineer and someone who was working on standards and so on in the ITU, I think the key is education and awareness and dialogue. It's like with any other addiction that kids might have, or any desire of things that they want to do that may not be age appropriate, the importance of dialogue is critical, and being able to be equipped as a parent or as a teacher with the importance of that psychological safety in the digital environment is critical. So in the ITU, what we have been working on for many years is the child online protection. And it's a whole suite of educational material in different languages. We have to also be cognizant of not everyone speaks English. And the majority of the rest of the world and the parents that are teaching and the teachers who are teaching the kids need to have that content into their native language so that the dialogue with the children is one of guiding and educating and raising awareness of the dangers of accepting applications without reading or without understanding maybe the business model. Why are you getting something for free? Somebody else must be making money on that transaction. So that's part of the awareness raising activity. So I think and also we cannot approach this with total fear because it's a spectrum. One is complete openness to data and using applications without any verification of the license agreement or the use of, and the implications of it. And the other extreme is to be offline. And how can you imagine not being online today?
Right.
Because there are so many applications for good. Education, healthcare, financing, inclusion, learning. So you need to have the child connected, but in a protected and aware manner.
Absolutely. That education is so important. And even the terminology, I think, is so important. Yeah. You know, us old people talk about going online. Children don't use that terminology. They have an on life. Off is what we have to remind them of because all they know is the on. And so I think even just creating different terms and words and educating so they know what they mean, right?
In fact, they even have their own syntax. Like my native language is Arabic. I'm Tunisian. And when I see my kids typing, because initially the keyboards did not have the various languages,
Sure.
So they would be typing Arabic in English or French alphabet. And it's like is 3, which is like, looks like in Arabic, but first time I looked like, what language are you using? It's like Tunisian. Like
you need a translator.
You have to have a translator of the syntax.
That's right. Well, I want to turn then from where we are right now and talk about some of the tensions, I think, that create obstacles when we're trying to solve some of these issues. And there's a few that I'd like to explore here. Leanda, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you. You and I had a really interesting, we met each other yesterday, right? You'd come in on the train and we were having a conversation. And I think where we're going, I think we'll even find some country to country differences. But we had an interesting conversation about this tension between children's rights versus what parents perceive their rights to be. And do parents have rights when it comes to what their children experience online? I'm going to leave it at that and let you explore it further, but I found that to be a really thought-provoking conversation for me. So,
yeah, I think it's really, really interesting, and it is absolutely a crucial point. Firstly, because children should be at the center based on their rights, but also because I think this is something which is used very much to shift this debate and shift the burden onto parents in particular, and also back to children themselves. So children have rights, right? So children have rights as established by the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And for American friends in the room, the convention has been signed by all UN member states, and it has not been ratified by 3 countries. So it has not been ratified by North Korea, Somalia, and the United States of America. But you still have it signed, so you can still use it to a certain extent. But it does complicate discussions in the US. But everywhere else, and we're a global organization, and we think we need global standards, and we think they should be based on international law. Everywhere else, children have rights. Now, do parents have rights? Interestingly, if you Google, yes, I do Google still. Yeah. If you Google, do parents have rights? What you will find under international law is that parental rights are often generally called parental responsibilities. So we all have human rights. Children have rights on top of that. And as parents, you have responsibilities. You can call it, the right to, help your child decide, but actually it's the responsibility to look after your child and help your child, right? So children have rights. Parents in themselves, internationally under human rights law do not have a specific set of rights. Of course, then, in national law there might be very specific things which are set out. And I say that this is really important because, as I say, Children themselves are often left out of the conversation. It's often about what parents need to do, and tech companies really do push the burden back and say this is a parental responsibility. And I'm all for parents taking their responsibilities well. I am all for also digital literacy and education and things. But, and I'm very optimistic also about what tech can do and about the future. So I'm definitely a tech optimist. And at Five Rights, when we say we're building the digital world children deserve, it is a positive vision. But we have to be realistic about where we're coming from. And where we're coming from is a system where a few companies who have set an agenda, which is now being replicated also by anyone else who wants to compete in the market. A few companies have set something out which is highly, highly problematic, and where parental controls, reporting systems, education are just not going to make the cut yet. Maybe one day.
Sure. Yeah. Bilel, yes.
I want to weigh in on the children's right and the human rights, which is a conversation we've been having in Geneva with the High Commissioner on Human Rights and the resolutions that came out from the Human Rights Council that talk about human rights and technology. And in fact, the ITU was cited as one of the standards organizations that works hand in hand with the High Commissioner on Human Rights to ensure that human rights are taken by design in new technologies and new standards that we develop. It's like security by design, privacy by design, it's human rights by design. How do you do that? Because before working for the ITU, I used to work in the private sector, building products and selling telecom equipments and services. And as an engineer and as a standards professional, our lens was how can we build the best product that technically works and will sell in the market in a cost-effective way. But the lens of human rights was never there. So it was mostly a commercial goal and objective is to build the best product and be able to sell it and have diffusion, have everyone use it around the world. But human rights has never been one of the lenses in that conversation 15 years ago. Now, what we're trying to do, ITU and the High Commissioner on Human Rights, is to raise the awareness in the companies and the engineers who are designing the products and the standards leaders who come to the ITU. We have like 1,000 private sector entities who write the standard and have the consensus on various, like PII, for example. Having them be aware of the human right consequences of things that they might be designing, facial recognition, for example, or other applications. Every technology will have two sides. Whether you use it for good or bad is kind of outside but having that lens added to the constraints of design is a critical one that we have been working on to ensure that all countries, 194 member states of the ITU, all companies, the 1,000 companies working with us are aware of that. In fact, just to close on this point, at the World Telecom Standards Assembly that took place in October in New Delhi, we had like 3,700 participants from 165 countries on our standards plans for the next 4 years. And we had a declaration read during our plenary from Freedom Online Coalition to express the human rights aspects of technology and to ensure that all member states put that on the table when they are thinking about deploying the next data center, providing more connectivity, having applications available for kids or adults. It's the whole vulnerable community. Sometimes you have the children who may not be aware of the vulnerabilities, but you also have the adults who may not be literate, may not be digitally literate, who might take deep fakes as a given. And that's why in the ITU we created this coalition on combating deep fakes and having multimedia authenticity with ISO and IEC, the other two international organizations in Geneva, to give policymakers a tool to combat these AI-generated deepfakes, whether it's text, video, images, and so on.
Well, as the father of a son with a disability, I love to hear that kind of language, right? That human rights aren't based on ability, right? That you should have them inherently protected regardless and protected from your own vulnerabilities sometimes in the very design. That feels like what the internet, as I read some of the original words, back from Stanford in the early 2000s, I think this is the type of internet we imagined, and we've been given something different. Let's get back to the beautiful thing that I think we all imagined is what I'm hearing in your words. Gives me a little bit of hope. I like that.
Absolutely. And that's why we launched the AI for Good platform like 7-8 years ago, 2017, because we believe that data and algorithms should be applied for good to achieve the sustainable development goals. And this was way before ChatGPT. So we worked on AI for health, to use AI and data for health applications, for AI for natural disaster management, because when you go through all the satellite imaging and the Internet of Things data, you can actually predict a natural hazard that's going to happen. and you can mitigate it and manage it better. AI for agriculture to raise the crop production. So as we have this conversation about data and data privacy, we also need to be cognizant of the good applications and kind of focus the attention there, while also focusing on the attention on how to protect and how to ensure human rights are there, how the design is taking, and mix two of us. I have my youngest son has Down syndrome.
So and my middle son has Down syndrome.
There we go. So we have a different, a rich experience. I mean, he was my best teacher, mine and my wife's, because you learn to be patient, you learn to be inclusive, you learn to be diverse. And in our conversation today, he's a vulnerable victim of, on his phone accepting lots of applications. So I had to spend a lot of time explaining to him, these applications might be good, don't accept these, don't talk to anyone. And that continuous conversation, he's actually now able to manage by himself.
I feel like you're saying all my words. That's so a kindred spirit here. So, we were talking a little bit more on what things are moving in the right direction. Gaia, given all the conversations we have and your focus on design, at the same time, I sometimes fall back into what hope is there against a machine that's been designed for so many years against us, right? There's a tension there in my sense of hope that how are we going to convince the design to be changed? How are we going to change the incentives to put children and to put rights into the center of this conversation, given those headwinds and the concentration of power that we're up against?
Okay. I think there are two parts to your question. The first question is, what do children want? And that's something I think we should dig a bit deeper into, and then what can be done. Because if you think about what children want and you ask children, they're less concerned about how the information is commodified. What they care about, they don't want their parents to share their photos. Sharing is something they don't like. And they want control. They don't like surveillance. They don't want, and we know that parents track their kids' location, they track how fast they drive a car, and this makes we're in a very difficult situation here, because we also know that what tech companies doing, especially social media, is greatly harming these kids, keeping them online for as long as possible, taking them to very dark places where they could get information on how to commit suicide or how to become anorectic. And the thing is, when the kids are smaller, you can monitor what happens when they grow older. How do you, and they become angry because they want their autonomy, they want their privacy from their parents. So there are two types of privacy: the privacy from the tech industry and the privacy from their parents. What do you do in a world where these tensions exist? And I think, going now to the solution, I believe that focusing on the tech industry's business model is the solution that eventually will also solve the kids' privacy problem against their parents. Because if you think about the business model, we have basically tech companies giving products for free, giving Facebook for free, giving Gmail for free, Instagram, Snapchat, but we pay, and our children pay, with time and with data. So these tech companies want the kids online for as long as possible so they can collect more data on them. Then they want them online for as long as possible so they can target the ads which are based on the data. Now, kids are a very lucrative market. A recent study from Harvard showed that social media companies alone make $11 billion a year from kids under 18. So how do we reconcile this? I think that we need to focus on laws that target the tech companies, because once this universe changes, where kids are not constantly pulled online to dangerous places, parents can also let go. And the second issue of privacy will hopefully become more resolved.
I think that's an excellent point. Go ahead, Bilel. Yes.
Our studies show that we have been in the ITU doing the cybersecurity index for countries. The report was published 24, the previous one in 21. Cybersecurity includes the data aspects and data privacy and protection. And we see that legislation alone is not sufficient because like 175, remembering off the top of my head, countries have legislation on cybersecurity and data protection. But then they don't have the tools to implement, and they don't have the policy and the knowledge, the cybersecurity and data protection expertise to implement and be able to really police those legislations that are being put in place. However, the story is getting better because if we compare the 2021 data, cybersecurity index, to 24, we see a lot of improvements. More countries have a national cybersecurity agenda. More countries have CERT, computer incident response teams. More countries have cybersecurity awareness education and drills, cybersecurity drills. It's the broad cybersecurity, but I think data protection is part of that conversation. So certainly legislation alone is not sufficient. It's important to have it, but then we need to equip countries and families and schools where the children spend most of the time outside of the home with those tools to be able to protect them.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I will probably. I mean, I very much support regulation. I think it's absolutely the starting point. So I think first of all, when it comes to kids, right? Because we can talk about different technology, we can talk about cybersecurity in general. But when it comes to kids, first of all, we need to be clear that there is a real issue right now, and it's urgent, and we have to find solutions to something which is systemic, right? So we can't push it back. We can't say, okay, we educate slow, which is a really slow thing. Education takes a lot of time, and it's something I agree we need to do. But we need something now. Now, the key thing is that the tech industry has presented itself as exceptional, right? This is the digital world. This is not the same. Human rights don't necessarily apply. There are other rights. Shall we create digital rights? And existing regulation won't work. And hang on a sec. We have rights. We need to implement and enforce them. We have regulations and regulatory approaches that have been effective in shaping industries throughout time and innovation throughout time. We have basic product safety. Product safety is a system which says you as a company, you can develop something, but then if you want to put it on the market, you have to be able to prove that you've done your due diligence and that it's safe. Yes, you can go invent your computer system in your garage, but you cannot market it and start making money out of it, unless it's safe. And if it suddenly explodes, you're going to have to recall all your products, right? There are established approaches that we need to use. So I agree, we don't have the right necessarily legislation and regulation at the moment. It is really broad, it's often not child-specific, but this is what we need to do. And in this sector, when it comes to addressing the issues that our children are facing and actually bringing about practical changes to the design of services, regulation is the only thing that has worked. There have been a few studies come out last year looking at how data protection regulation, the age-appropriate design code, how these have been the ones, not only now you see advertising everywhere of all the great things tech companies are doing for your kids. Yeah, why are they doing that? Because they're under pressure. But also, they have stopped notifications throughout the night. They have put in privacy controls. Instagram for kids, not great in my opinion, but they are, they're doing something because they're feeling the pressure of regulation and legislation. So we're not there yet. And of course, once we have that, we need to enforce it, and then we need education, and then we need technical guidance and standards. We need education for engineers. There are tons of things that we need, but without regulation, and like I say, 5 rights, we tried it before, yeah? I mean, everybody has tried digital education things for a long time. It hasn't made any difference because we're up against a multi-trillion-dollar industry that represents 25% of GDP who have a very strong commercial interest in it not moving. The only thing that will make it move is, it could be that consumers, everybody changes platform. That will take time, but regulation is a necessary starting point. We have to stop this tech exceptionalism and bring it back into the ecosystem of rights and established rules.
Absolutely. Gaia, do you want to build on that? Yeah, that's good.
Too. I think I consider myself a pragmatist, and my view of regulation is very broad. Yeah, so data regulation is one part of it, but I think this business model can break in different ways. It can break through regulation on data, which is part of it. But the moment you regulate data, for example, you're making the whole business model less lucrative. Because if it's harder to collect data, then the whole thing becomes more expensive. If you restrict kids' access to social media, or you restrict use of addictive features, you're also making the business model less attractive, and you make it less profitable to collect data because you have applied pressure from a different perspective. Third thing is targeted advertising. The FTC, just before I was flying here, came out with a rule saying that it's going to prohibit targeted advertising for kids. That also really creates a problem for this whole model. So there are many things that can be done, and also we have to, and I don't believe it's just regulation. It can be many other things. If you think about what kids care about so much. So let's go to the sharing thing, sharing pictures. So I'm guilty myself. I was a young mom when Facebook started. My kids' photos, I'm afraid to say, are all over Facebook. But now my kids are teens. And, I have to go through excruciating consent processes to get anything posted there. Even if they're just, seen far away in the background. So there are some things that education can help with. And we have to understand, why are we sharing things? It's also part of the problem, because we're also addicted. And then going back to this regulation for kids, how is this going to help? Because regulation for kids is really the first step. I believe in regulation for kids because kids are the Achilles heels of the whole thing. We always regulate to protect kids. It's easier to get it through. But the goal is to change the designs for all of us. So we won't feel so compelled to share our kids' photographs on Facebook.
In the first place.
On
Go ahead, Bilel.
Tuesday this week, I was on a similar panel in a high school here in Davos, in the open forum. And one of the panelists was one of the kids in school. She actually missed her math class to join us at 8:30 in the morning. And the conversation was, what do we do in the interim? While the regulations are being put in place and there are ways to protect the children online, they are online today. What do we do? And the opportunity cost of just swiping and so on. Right. So one of the ideas that emerged in that discussion is diversion. Like, give them something else to do, get them interested in something else to do that is more productive. And so some of the teachers were talking about getting them more involved in social activities that are physical, going out to a hike, doing things that are more social and personal and not in the virtual world, but in the real world. Or if they're using technology, get them focused on something productive. So one of the things we're doing in the ITU is the robotic youth competitions, where we target middle school, primary school kids to get them really interested in the technology, but now instead of just doing screen time, they're actually building robots and competing within the school, within the country, and globally, and then we bring the best competitors to receive an award and be put in the spotlight. So we need to think pragmatically and have some innovation on how, not just to focus on a problem that we may not be able to solve today, but create other means to deal with it and be adaptive. And just on last point here, observing my kids and growing up, they have adapted. I mean, some of them closed some of the accounts, moved to other applications. Right. They know what to do and not to do. So kids are also quite adaptive, quite smart, as long as you guide them throughout the process and protect them when they don't know, when they're really vulnerable.
No, I think it's a great point. I'm glad you shared about that, because I think it's important to keep children's voices. I don't just mean young children, but I'm talking about teenagers and tweens. We need to keep their voices central in this conversation so that they have a say. I've heard a lot about, I think it was Rebecca, yesterday you were talking about agency as such an important part of this, and I think that's a key part of this, so they have that awareness and can make some of those choices. From your perspective, Gaia or Leanda, what are some ways that we can keep their voices, their perspectives center in a conversation that is ultimately about them?
Well, I think if I look in the US, there have been hundreds of bills and laws all over the states. And if you try to see what they're really about, you can see there are two types. There's one type that tries to regulate tech companies in different ways. I won't go into the details. But there's another type that puts the responsibility on parents, basically saying parents should consent if their kids are on social media. Parents can see who the kids are connected to in social media and monitor, or even more, some law says kids can have access to their, parents can have access to their kids' communications on social media. So, and there are some laws that combine these parents and tech companies' rights. So I think it's really, really important that we end up with hybrid laws that first of all put the onus on the tech companies. Right. Because first of all, I don't think parents can do this effectively. We've had years of parental controls, which parents tried so hard to use, it doesn't work. You want to change the world to give parents an easier world to work with. Then you can also have laws that give them tools, because we know that children are different. Some children are more vulnerable. But even these laws should be carefully crafted to give parents some control while not taking away the kids' ability to have some privacy in their communications. Our communications were made in private. Right. Our parents could not hear what we were telling our friends. If parents have access to their kids' communications, they do not want that. They cannot develop, they cannot have the privacy that we had. And I think we should really think about that. And one more thing I'll add. Please. Tech companies, if they don't want any laws, but if they would go for something, they want the parent laws, because they know parents can't do this effectively. So we have to be very, very careful at what comes out of all of this.
Right, it's a bit of a deception, right?
Yeah.
You're stirring up all these other images. You know, before you were talking about parents not being involved in our conversations as children. And I'm going to age myself a little bit here, but do you remember stretching the phone into the closet, right, with the cord across the hallway to get a little privacy? And if you heard someone pick up the other line, you're like, shh, right? And you wanted that space in order to explore relationship. And we can't rob them of that either. Leanda, at Five Rights, I know it's important for you also as an organization to really listen to those voices, keep children at the center. It's cliche to say, well, keep them, but that's actually action, I think, at Five Rights. Talk a little bit about that for me.
Well, it might be cliche to say it, but who's doing it? Yeah. I mean, we're here. We're all here, that's nice, but where are the kids? So, you know, children have a right to participate. They have a right to be part of decision-making when it affects them, right? That is, again, their fundamental right based on the convention. But it is totally ignored. So we have tech companies, indeed, who are undermining their agency. And kids are saying we're fed up of being not only surveilled by our parents, but we're fed up of being bullied and manipulated by these companies. But at the same time, they're not part of the conversation. And more, it's like, oh, we're listening to youth. Well, children are all young people up to the age of 18, and they have specific rights. And we need to be very careful that we make the effort to bring those young people to the table, and that we don't say, okay, 25 to 35-year-olds, you know, will do the job. It's much easier, I tell you, it's much easier, but we have to listen to children. And children are very, very clear and very eloquent, and they're very knowledgeable about this. So, you know, they do bring a lot to the table. At Five Rights, we have, everything we do is underpinned by children's voices. We have more than 200 youth ambassadors around the world in more than 50 countries who feed into our research, feed into our advocacy. Amazing. We put their voices at the center. We bring them to the table of policy events. And it is difficult, but it is absolutely critical and extremely valuable. Do you mind if I just add one more thing, just to come back, indeed, on can we solve the problem? So I'd like to discuss afterwards what good law looks like, but I think, you know, we have to remember that we can solve the problem within the next 5 to 10 years. This is not impossible. This idea that, oh, it's very complicated, you know, we can't do it, we have to address everything all at once. You know, we do not want this to become a climate change sort of debate. We do not want it to get there. At the moment, we are in a place where it is still manageable. We have awareness, we have a not enormous number of companies who are creating the issues that we're dealing with and who are setting the stage. And we're at the point where we're just shaping that regulation. So now is the time. We do have the opportunity to create effective global standards now. If we miss the opportunity, we'll be in a lot more trouble and it will be a lot more difficult. And we know that there's huge amount of lobbying going into saying, oh, well, this isn't good enough. We need more laws, they will say, or we need it to be more harmonized. We need more. And AI is completely different from digital services, different from data protection. You need different regulators. And then we don't know what regulator to go to. I mean, there is a strategy here. And it really is about political will. It's about political will to take on giants, and it's not easy. And this is the problem with the data protection piece, that it has been very effectively undermined to make it all about cookie banners and data access requests and things, and really, really avoid the data minimization, the purpose limitation, the fair and transparent enforcing your terms and conditions. This is what data protection was supposed to be about, yeah? And now it's overwhelmed by all sorts of stuff that is, could be relevant, but is not the crux of the debate. It doesn't get to the business model. We have to stop this from going too far. There is an opportunity. A few years ago, this debate would not have been happening. You would probably not all have been here. The world has changed in a few years.
That's right.
We've gone a long way. We keep this momentum up, and we apply the pressure, and we have that political will, and we can make fundamental systemic changes which will set us up for a sustainable future. It's possible, and kids indeed need to be at that table.
Wow. Round of applause. That was, I felt like I was, you don't care about this issue at all, do you? I was watching a master class in motivation there around this topic. I felt like that was just fabulous. And I think you hit on something, right? A moment. We sit in a moment before we scale harm through AI in a way that is unlike anything that we have seen in the past 10 to 20 years. I feel like 2025 is the moment. This room may be the moment, right? The spark that we make a change. And so, Bilel, you find yourself, right, with member states all over the world, right? This standardization maybe globally. Maybe before we head into questions here, just give us, you spoke earlier in your introduction about a more global standard around this. What does that practically and tactically look like when there are differences of opinions when it comes to surveillance, when it comes to privacy, when you look at country-to-country differences? How do you mediate that? How do you balance that? And how do you get to a solution?
It's tough. Consensus building is a tough one because it has to be inclusive of all the opinions and all the voices. We are dealing with 194 member states. We're dealing with 1,000 private sector. The companies you're alluding to are all members and are all active. And we in the ITU as Secretariat provide that platform for the dialogue, for science-based discussions on, like 10 years ago, many companies were against the universal charger. Now it's regulated everywhere. Everyone is using a universal charger because at that time it was perceived as a threat to the business model, because when you buy a phone, you buy a charger with it, and it's unique for that phone model or company and so on. And there was a big struggle. We convened. There was a study group that brought the private sector and countries and governments to say, there is so much e-waste, we need to stop it. Mm-hmm. And the way to do it is to have a standard charger with a detachable cable, and that reduced tremendously the e-waste. And the EU regulated that just a couple of years ago. You have to have a universal charger if you're selling something in the EU. So I agree with you. Once the regulation and the legislation and the technical standards are there, you can have impact. In our topic, to have the youth engaged. Today, the ITU, this year, we celebrate 160 years of existence. It was established in 1865 to do the standards on the telegraph. It used to be called the International Telegraph Union. Today, we're at the heart of the conversation on AI for good. So we have evolved, or the organization evolved with technology. What we are doing differently now is to include youth voices in the conversation. We have a youth task force for in-house to ensure that the recruiting is gender balanced, but also age balanced. Our Secretary General, Doreen Bogdan Martin, has a youth task council from the 6 regions where young, who were children just a few years ago. I know they're not children, but and there is like adult and so on, like you cannot really bring under 18. But those voices are important to shape the conversation of future standards, because you have kids that are part of this digital age. They know the harms and the opportunities and how they grew up in that era, and now can help shape international standards going forward. And the last point, once our standards are developed, they're publicly available. And we develop guidance on the implementation. So the child online protection that is being led by the ITU is based on many of the standards that we develop. PII is one of them, but there are identity management. Yesterday we launched the Open Wallet Forum, which is working with the open source community, where you have a lot of kids developing software. To be able to have a digital identity that is based on standards, and then you have your credentials and all of your digital wallets, your ID, your driver's license, various technologies that are protected and interoperable cross-border.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We've just scratched the surface, but we've got to let the crowd now join the conversation. So.
Can somebody ask what good law looks like? Just saying.
That's right. Yeah, I think I have some thoughts there too. But yes, I think let's turn now. If there are some questions, go ahead and, as usual, raise your hand, and Laura has a microphone that she'll pass around. Please introduce yourself, and then.
Yes, my name is Juan Carlos Lara, and I lead the ESG Lab worldwide from Switzerland. Great panel, thank you very much. Yet it leaves me more concerned at the end than what I was at the beginning of it. Because I agree, indeed, the social media is a terrible problem for children and also for us, the adults. Yet I hear that the regulation, policing, laws is mostly the solution that you think the future should be. About regulation, in 2006, the European Union had the same GDP as the United States. In 2006, the European Union decided to start implementing regulations in the European Union. Now the GDP of the European Union is half of the United States because of all these regulations. The biggest player 2 days ago in the world said enough with regulations. No more WHO and no more many organizations. So I'm not saying that that is good or bad. I am saying that that is the next world for the next couple of years. Having had this kind of experience and this reality, Meta said enough with European Union regulations. Twitter said enough with European Union regulations. We are not going to fact check things, right?
Right.
So thinking outside the box and,
yes.
and thinking besides regulations, what is the solution for this problem? Because the problem is just going to increase. Social media use is going to increase, unfortunately. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. I think, Leanda, you were just getting into what does good look like? Because I think sometimes when you think of regulation, you think of a lot of slow-moving, difficult to implement, difficult to enforce things. But I think at least what I've seen work is surgical approaches to narrow things, to solve the problem of the elephant sort of one bite at a time. So do you have any thoughts on that? What do some of those solvable one bite sort of approaches look like?
Okay, first, I don't want to live in a world without regulation. I don't know if you do, but there are some minimum standards I think that we need, but it needs to be good regulation. And it's not the only thing. I actually think that education for engineers is something that we need to invest massively in. If anyone's interested in talking about that, we can talk about it afterwards. But in terms of the regulation piece, so there is good regulation and there's bad regulation. There's a lot of regulation, like I talked about GDPR, which ends up just in huge amounts of paperwork. And I would say that the tech sector has really lawyered up to make the regulation in place just a question of red tape and delays and making things more complicated, rather than using regulation as a tool for good good product development. So, the responsibility on all sides, not just the regulators. But what does good regulation look like? And Gaia said that, in the US there's a lot of stuff and there's a lot of bad stuff as well out there. So good regulation, first of all, needs to be rights-based. At the moment, a lot of it is not, which is hugely problematic afterwards. It needs to be outcomes-based. We need to set the world that we want to see, and we need to hold companies accountable to that. So it has to be you set the standard and you allow companies to innovate to it. So really prescriptive regulation, you should do this, you should do that, don't do this, don't do that, ends up really complicated. And in this sector, it's just not going to work because it's like changing so fast. So you're always going to be regulating for the past. We need to regulate for the future. So if you look at the regulation that we work on, if you look at the age-appropriate design code as a model, it's outcome-based, so it sets certain standards of what we want to see. It's implementable, right? It's tech-neutral. That's really, really important. Please do not regulate just for social media. Right? Everybody talks about social media. We've touched upon EdTech, which is massive and totally flying under the radar at the moment. There's gaming, and that's just talking about some of the main buckets for kids. But what happens if you regulate one sector is your problem goes elsewhere. And then it's like, how did you define social media, et cetera, et cetera. So it has to be tech neutral. There have to be, clear principles. So best interests, age appropriate. So based on development, default settings by design and results, default settings. When we're talking about data minimization. So there are some really, really core principles. But then it sets that expectation, and I say it lets the company innovate. The point being that as a regulator, you do not want to have to chase. As a regulator, you want to say, this is what we want to see, and if we see evidence that your product is causing harm, right? So again, think product safety. Your product is causing harm, and we have, mental health systems, we have hospitals coming in with data about, suicides linked to, these things, Instagram, for example. You have that, then you need, as a regulator, you need to be able to go back to the company and say, show me how you did your due diligence. Right? Show me how you did your due diligence. Show me what questions you asked based on technical standards and things. There are tools for this. What questions you asked, how the decisions were made, what criteria, how you tested, how you made decisions, who takes responsibility for those decisions that you then chose option A, option B. And then I, as a regulator, can make a decision of whether, you made a mistake and should just go back and fix it, or whether you are actually, liable. This is good regulation that we can use to hold companies accountable in the longer term.
Any other thoughts outside of that maybe we're not thinking about, outside of the box a little bit?
Yeah, so first of all, I've never sat in a panel with somebody I've agreed with so much, so thank you for everything you're saying, Leanda. And I want to talk a bit more about the bigger picture, which I think should make us more optimistic. Taking aside the current political situation, which is, of course, unpredictable, looking, in my book on Wired, I looked at the past. So I'm taking cigarettes because it's a good example, because we know that cigarettes are so bad. And it's interesting to see how long it got to get to a world in which people are not smoking. It took a long time. And it took many things. Regulation was one of them, but not the only thing. It started after a decade of research. 1964, the Surgeon General announced that cigarettes are a bad thing. Decades of class action litigation until smokers finally started to win. But that applied pressure, which led to a big settlement. There was also regulation on advertising and regulation on warnings. That's big warnings on cigarette packs. In the US, we got an advisory from the Surgeon General saying we should have warnings on social media. So a big thing that's happening now is what's happening in schools. The bans in schools, whether they're coming from the parents bottom up, or they're coming top down from states, from countries, from cities, that's a huge thing, because you're creating a space where kids are not on screens. You're sending a message about screens. So regulation is a necessary thing. I don't think tech companies are ever going to change without regulation. They said, Zuckerberg for years talked about how they can fix everything, and we saw how well this has worked. Self-regulation is not going to work. We need regulation to exert pressure, but there are many points of pressure. And we should not think that if something is taking more than a year, it's a failure. Litigation often fails and then eventually succeeds, for example.
Excellent. I would also highly recommend, the YouTube channel for Human Change will have recordings of these. There was a fascinating conversation with Tristan Harris sitting in this chair talking about what it looks like to flip the incentive structure so that we incentivize with humans at the center first. And it seems big and impossible, but I think he laid out some very possible steps along the way that I think start to get at other angles, other pressure points that I think are so critical here. Thank you, Juan Carlos, for that. I appreciate.
Can I just...
Yeah, and you'll be next. Go ahead,
2
Bilel.
seconds
Yes.
on the incentive. You just reminded me of a conversation I had last week with a telecom regulator from Europe, where she was saying on the quality of service of voice and data on the network, a regulator is one, and then there are 3 operators, network operators. So being the policeman, you're outnumbered. But in that country, they changed to an incentive model. And now the quality of service of the telephone, the voice, the data has improved because it moved from punishment to incentive. But you just said it in the context of what Tristan was saying, the context of data. I think we need to be innovative in that space.
That's right. Yeah, I've heard all kinds of interesting conversations around that. So I would highly recommend watching that. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. Go ahead, yes.
I'm Stephen Rosenbaum. I lead the Sustainable Media Center in New York, which is an intergenerational organization. And I have a question, because of how smart this panel is, and because this hasn't come up, I will share with you a question a 14-year-old asked me that I think you guys will be good
Smarter
to answer.
than all of us, right? Yeah.
When we talk to young people, one of the questions we ask them is, what do you love about the internet? What do you love about social media?
Excellent.
And what do you wish would be different?
Yes.
So this 14-year-old girl thought about that for a moment. This is about 2 weeks ago. And she said, I wish there were better age gating. And I presumed I knew what she meant, and I said, explain what concerns you, knowing that I was walking into dangerous territory. And she said, well, I'm on Instagram, and there are all these other kids on Instagram that are like 8 or 9 years old, but they claim to be 14. And that really angered her.
Wow.
And it reminded me that when you don't talk to young people, the things we think they're bothered by aren't necessarily what they are. So I would ask all of you, where are we on age gating? We talk about youth and children and Gen Z kind of interchangeably, but we serve the same product to all of them. Is age gating in the future?
I think this is a great question. Thank you for
Excellent.
bringing
Thank
that
you,
up.
Stephen.
So it's interesting because when we talk about age gating, we usually are worried about age gating up, so basically to 18. And so, but I think if the problem is resolved, it should apply everywhere. The problem in the United States is that tech companies are making very cynical arguments that you cannot age gate because this violates the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and it violates rights of privacy. So first of all, to hear this argument that from tech companies that privacy is violated is a bit tough. But thinking about it seriously, I think that there is progress being made in the cases, in the case law, in the upcoming Supreme Court case law. And we also have to think about what's really at stake here. Age gating. Something is very strange. In the US, we have like this divide. In the physical world, you cannot buy cigarettes, you cannot buy alcohol, you cannot drive, and your age is checked. Online, we are stuck with these old laws in which you cannot know how old anybody is. This does not make a lot of sense. What they also say, this will violate everyone's privacy. This is a very technological, deterministic argument that we can never have systems which are private enough. We know that there are lots of great people working on systems which are third-party systems, which will keep the information private. The tech companies won't have to do it themselves. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is that tech companies know how old everybody is.
They do.
That's how they sell us product. They have great systems. So again, going to how cynical this argument is. So basically, I think this is heading in the right direction, and once it's resolved, it will solve the age problem going down as well.
May I come in on?
Yeah, sir. It sounds like maybe just down the line here. So go ahead, Leanda.
Okay, great. No, age assurance and age verification is an absolutely critical piece of the debate, and it's also one that's very heavily weaponized. So, as Gaia said, they know how old you are. So, other kids, things they'll say to us are things like, how come that they know that I like, this very, very specific product, et cetera, and yet they say they don't know how old I am? It's like, well, of course they know how old I am. The thing is, it's very, very convenient to know your favorite color, where you live, your sexuality. It's very convenient to know all of that because it's useful for marketing. It is not convenient to know how old you are officially, because if I know that you're a child, really, frankly, why should I be doing this to you? So, you have to be quite cynical about this. It's really interesting that, the 14-year-old says that. We hear that all the time. Older children, it's a bit like my friend said, I have a friend who. So they're full of recommendations for younger children. That 14-year-old probably doesn't want age gating for herself, but she absolutely wants age gating for younger people. But it really does say something. They really feel that it is not appropriate, the things that, they are doing and seeing. Now, age assurance, it's a basic know your customer, If your customer is a child, if your user is a child, there are many, many legal reasons. Data protection is one of them, why you need to know and give special protections to that. On the other hand, it is not the silver bullet. So this idea, just ban kids, keep them off, age gate everything. We have to have age gating for porn, for gambling. There are other laws on that, right? We don't need other laws. There are laws for that already. But things like, and sorry, I was going to say, you have to enforce your own terms and conditions. If you say that your product is for, over 13 or over 16, then you should be enforcing that because that's a contract that you are making with your user. And as that little girl said, they are not honoring their contract with her. So that's one thing. But, age assurance or age verification, which are not quite the same thing, should be about making a product suitable for the child. It should not be about shutting children out from places where they want to be. It needs to be done in a privacy-preserving, in a proportionate way, and it has to be done, for the best interests of the child, and not, as I say, for shutting them out of spaces. And it can be used, for example, in Australia. There is this huge frustration to do something immediately now, so it can be used maybe as a temporary tool, but it's never going to be the long-term solution. If you age gate at one point, it still has to be only to make the system appropriate, age appropriate, and then give children access to a digital world that is meant and that delivers for them.
Thank you. Did you want to weigh in there before Grace? Next, yes. Okay. Okay. Go ahead. Then one more. Did I get the name right?
Grace, yes.
Yeah, we met earlier. Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Go ahead.
So I'm a governance geek, and I think so. I want to phrase this properly. I think we're using the word regulation in a way that encompasses three things. One is legislation, one is regulation, and the other one is punishment. And we used to live in a world, I grew up in a world, I'm not an engineer, and I don't know how we did this, but when, just a few years ago, doors did not fall off of airplanes. That was regulation. The door never, ever, ever fell off an airplane in mid-flight, and that's regulation. Now, when the door falls off an airplane in mid-flight, we punish the airline. And I want actual regulation. I don't care what the legislation says. I don't really want the regulator to check after the child has been committing suicide. I want it regulated so the child doesn't commit suicide. And it doesn't necessarily have to come to legislation. But regulation is something very specific. It means I never get to that point. And so how are regulators and some of you thinking about actual prevention, not we're going to punish the company later, because that's just a cost of doing business.
Thank you. Thank you, Grace.
I think if you take an example from the EU AI Act, when they're talking about different risks levels and having risk assessments and banning certain systems, that would be an example of doing something before the fact, and which will hopefully not endanger kids. And some of these highest risk categories are related to kids.
Any other thoughts related to that?
So I do use regulation a little bit broadly. In some countries, what we pass is primary law. In some cases, it's secondary law, and it can be, even to the point of technical standards. There's a whole number of things there. But you're completely right. It has to be upstream. It has to be ex ante. It has to be about prevention. So normally there will be reporting, there will be, victim support, there will be those things, but our focus has to be on the system design, right? So that is, you design your aeroplane so the door doesn't fall off, right? And that is when you have a technical standard, and like I said, the questions that you ask yourself. Now, is it actually feasible to go and check every company before something comes to market? That's a very big question. That's when you get to the point where you have a block and nothing is going to happen. So that is why, I think effective regulation is about incentivizing that prevention, incentivizing good design, because you know that you're going to go out of business, right? So there might be checks within the industry system. Somebody checks the door. It doesn't mean that the door would never, ever, ever fall off. Didn't one fall off quite recently? It did. So, well, maybe that's capacity within regulators. I don't know. But it has to be ex ante. It has to be upstream. It has to be focused on prevention and on system design. But good regulation does that.
Well, thank you very much, friends. We are going to ask our panel, when we're done here, to move over to the side there. We're going to be moving to lunch. You never want to be the last panel before lunch to get in the way of people and food, and so we're going to let you get there next. But afterwards, after we have a time to spend some moments over there, we have another panel starting at 1:30 called The Business Case for Rethinking the Data Economy. So a good extension of this conversation here, so I'd love for you to come back. I think sometimes a topic like this can feel impossible, but we're not afraid here at the Human Change House of tackling big, gnarly issues. And I'm a runner, I'm an adventurer, I love to go on big hikes, and sometimes the destination, that mountain, that far off place looks impossible. I'm not in good enough shape. And sometimes what I find is beauty on the journey, that on the journey to impossible, you sometimes discover what is possible or wonderful along the way. So let's put children's data privacy out in front of us. Maybe feels impossible, but not let that stop us from beginning the journey to see what little micro steps that will build up over time to get to the solution to the problem. And I think some of that can happen right in this room, right here today. So thank you so much. Let us go ahead and give our panel a round of applause. Excellent conversation here. And thank you for being here today.